Hello cruel world. So today I'm going to tell you about a case, not just any case, but the most shocking case that I've personally ever experienced. So in interviews and in my previous AMA videos, I've been asked exactly that question. What is your most kind of tragic or emotional case? And this is it. So I don't usually do this, but I'm going to give you a trigger warning because it is pretty intense. This case was the first time that I gave evidence at the Old Bailey. And so this video is going to be more about my daily work as a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I have mentioned this case in other videos briefly, including when I was a guest with Sean Atwood, but this is going to be different because I've never done it in this much detail before. So let's set the scene a little bit. I was in my early 30s. I was a lowly specialist registrar, so I was like a middle grade psychiatrist, about 8 years out of medical school. When I tell you about this case, I am going to anonymize the patient as I do for all my cases, so I'll change some demographic details so she's less identifiable, but please be confident that the essence of my cases are 100% real. So we'll call the defendant Yasmin. She was a well-educated 18-year-old schoolgirl, and she had an unblemished past with no history of offending, no previous antisocial behaviour, or even being disruptive as a child. She never even got detention at school, which is more than I can say about myself. So Yasmin was described as being quite shy. She was timid. She only really had a couple of close friends. She was studious, she was quiet, and according to her teachers, it was an absolute pleasure to teach her. And Yasmin had also never been known to use alcohol or to use drugs. She was one of 4 siblings, and she had immigrant parents who owned a newsagent. So they were Indian, they were a family of painted people, they were Asian, such as me. And the parents drove all of the kids towards a professional career. Yasmin was such a good person that she even did voluntary shifts at the local hospital, although that was probably in part to enhance her application to medical school to become a doctor. So all of those things I'm talking about, all of them distinguish her from my typical clientele. Many of my patients' backgrounds, as you'll know from seeing my other videos, they include things like poverty, neglect, they usually have prominent criminal records, usually have a lot of drug use. So according to witness statements from her neighbours and also interviews with her family afterwards, in the weeks leading up to her horrendous offence, which was in early spring 2012, Yasmin had been displaying some uncharacteristic behaviours. So for example, she was kind of reprimanding her family for watching smut on TV, which is a bit weird because they assured me that they were just watching their usual sitcoms that they had done together as a family for years. Also, Yasmin started listening to this bizarre instrumental kind of flute music instead of her usual Miley Cyrus. And she'd be doing some other slightly odd things. She'd been chanting and making these weird kind of comments. So for example, she said that she could see her own soul leaving her body. And she said that she thought the sky was like painted on a very high ceiling. So in retrospect, I think this is a prodrome of psychosis. So prodrome, to educate you, is a period usually lasting a few weeks where the sufferer has like a change in feelings and their thoughts and their perceptions, and they have some odd behaviour. And this happens before they develop a full-blown psychosis. Psychosis is symptoms like hallucinations or delusions. So I think we can all agree that this is pretty odd behaviour, but it was no kind of warning for her horrendous act. So Yasmin, her elder brother was a software designer, and he actually lived in the family home along with his wife and along with his son, Sonny. And Yasmin had babysat Sonny, who was 2 years old at the time, many times before, no problems. But this fateful morning, according to the witness statements and the police interviews, as well as my own interviews with the family, Yasmin was just behaving in a slightly odd kind of way. She was clapping, she was singing, she was chanting loudly, and she was doing all this at her 5th floor bedroom window, which kind of oversees a courtyard so her neighbours could see her. And apparently that morning she mumbled something about seeing angels in the clouds to a younger sister. Younger sister had kind of gotten used to her slightly bizarre behaviour, so she kind of shrugged it off. So that morning, her other families left for school and for work, and Yasmin, who was going to college, had a couple of free periods, so the plan was she would stay home with little Sonny and she would babysit him. So fast forward about 5 hours and Yasmin's mother came home from the newsagents, and initially she just assumed that Sonny was asleep. And it was only about half an hour later that she realized he was unresponsive and he was dead. So Yasmin was confused at why she was making such a fuss. She started making bizarre comments. Her mother called the police. Neighbors who were living nearby heard her mother scream, so a crowd started to swell. And Yasmin started saying things like, "We should march to the Houses of Parliament to arrest the corrupt." And she kept reassuring anybody that would listen to her that she had smothered Sonny with a pillow, but it was only to remove demons from inside him. She also claimed that he would, and I quote, "wake up stronger than ever when the next full moon comes out." So as I said, her neighbors were coming and the crowd was smelling. Everybody was distraught. She kept trying to reassure people. She was saying everything would be fine as long as they dared to believe in angels. So she was obviously arrested. Next question what was Yasmin's presentation like in the police station? So I think it's fair to say that she was acting quite bizarrely. She started eating tissue paper at one point. She was making herself sick. She actually urinated through her own clothes. And obviously the police officers were concerned. In fact, there was some consideration of them calling a psychiatrist, although some police officers resisted this. I'm not 100% sure, because they didn't want her to kind of get away with it. They didn't want to give her a get out of jail free card. So instead she was remanded to Holloway Prison. So Holloway Prison was a large female prison. It's quite near to Camden Town in London. You might have heard of that place. It actually closed in 2016. So what was Yasmin's presentation in prison? She actually festered behind bars for a while, for want of a better word. She barely engaged with the prison officers. She was ignoring other inmates. She was just very kind of distant and withdrawn. She refused visits from her family members. She spent entire days kind of making these little origami shapes. And also she was like ripping out pictures of children from magazines and collecting them. So I wonder whether a tiny bit of reality of what she did has kind of seeped into her consciousness, because she seemed kind of preoccupied with children. However, even though this behavior was odd, it wasn't really kind of proof or indication of florid psychosis. So I think it's fair to say that Yasmin kind of slipped under the radar of the prison staff. They kind of took her prickliness as a young woman who kind of resigned herself to a terrible crime and was kind of living in guilt. So as well as one-off assessments like Yasmin's that I've done in prison, I also worked in prison regularly in a female prison for about 2 years. And I can say from my experience that it is a very chaotic, hectic place where you get a lot of severe agitation, often as a result of fights or beefs or gangs or bullying or an influx of illicit drugs, let alone psychiatric disorders, which is obviously my area of expertise. So what I'm trying to say is that the isolated, the people who are unobtrusively psychotic, like Yasmin, often go under the radar and they're not noticed. So what was Yasmin's presentation like in hospital? I was working in a female medium secure unit in London at the time. So I went to do an assessment in HMP Holloway. So I went to the legal visits hall, which is like this huge room where all the visits happen. And it was filled up with prisoners and with family members and with lawyers. And I remember just waiting, and I was quite anxious because I knew the time was running out for the appointment. But where was she? Where was Yasmin? She literally did not appear. So about half an hour into the scheduled appointment, I think one of the prison officers basically took pity on me. So they escorted me to Yasmin's prison cell, and I saw her in there. Yasmin had long, dark, neatly plaited hair, which framed this kind of unassuming face, non-murderous, for want of a better phrase, is what her face was like. And she had this kind of chocolate skin. But I would say that there was something odd about Yasmin, something kind of vacuous. So she had this strange smile, but it seemed painted on. It seemed like a veneer. It seemed really kind of fake. So Yasmin said that she'd forgotten about the prison appointment, which I thought was unlikely given that her schedule was probably empty because she was in prison. But throughout my entire assessment, she kept up this facade of normality. She completely denied all of her odd reported behaviors in the weeks leading up to the death of her nephew, and she claimed that she had a complete memory lapse of the actual incident itself. And what she said didn't really ring true to me. I thought she was being very guarded, evasive. On the surface, she was kind of ostensibly pleasant, but I just felt that I wasn't quite getting through with her. And I tried to form a rapport with her by making kind of anodyne, non-threatening inquiries, asking her about her life and her background and, you know, what was going on at school, because I didn't want to yet start digging around about her mental health issues, because I didn't basically want to scare her off. But I have to say that Yasmin's responses were kind of quite passive-aggressive. So she would say things like, "I already told you that, doctor," or "I don't see how that's relevant, doctor." So I have to say that I felt like I failed on my mission. I failed to extract the psychopathology to kind of consolidate it all into a definitive psychiatric diagnosis. So I'll be honest with you, I left the prison feeling a little bit uneasy that day because everything just didn't add up to me. I mean, the statement, what she said to the police about her nephew waking up at the full moon, she was talking about demons and angels, the odd behaviour that was happening at home and the weirdness at the police station and in prison, and also just her prickly indifference towards me, towards my assessment. I thought she was probably psychotic, but I didn't really have any hard proof. What I did is I applied to the Ministry of Justice for a warrant, and I managed to get Yasmin transferred to our ward under the provisions of a special criminal section of the Mental Health Act. In case you're interested, for all you geeks, that is section 49. It's like a remand section of the Mental Health Act. So it's a criminal part of the Mental Health Act. So Yasmin's court case was adjourned for about 6 weeks to give our services some time to try and treat her. 6 weeks is what the court decided, to be perfectly honest, is not a very long time in the treatment of mental illness. It's just a blink in the eye. So next question, what was Yasmin's presentation like on our medium secure unit? Well, obviously, given the situation and her circumstances and the timescale, we observed Yasmin really closely on the unit, myself and the whole mental health team. She was kind of mostly stoned-faced and kind of a bit robotic and emotionless, but when I asked her about her mood, she would say, "I'm happy, I'm very, very happy, I'm at utter peace," which is very kind of incongruous. It didn't add up to how she was presenting. And I have to say, again, a bit like prison, she kind of flew under the radar because there were so many more agitated, psychotic, unwell women on the ward, and Yasmin was really quiet, so it's quite easy to not even notice her on the ward. Even though she kept up this kind of facade, she did let the odd comment slip. Like, for example, and she would deny them afterwards. So, for example, she asked the nurses how to purify evil spirits. She kept asking me to send her literature on reincarnation. So Yasmin initially refused to take any oral antipsychotic medication, which is not unusual for our patients if they have a lack of insight. So we had to threaten her with depot injection antipsychotics. But luckily, she took the tablets after that. And within a few weeks of medication, she just started opening up a bit. I think we were just beginning to scratch the surface. Within that 6-week period, I also spoke to her brother. So that's the father of the victim, the little boy, Sonny, on several occasions. Obviously, it goes without saying that he was devastated. But nonetheless, I have to say he was very, supportive. He was very sympathetic. And I remember struggling in my conversations with him because on the one hand I was trying to convey hope about the future of his sister, although I didn't know what the outcome would be. I didn't know whether she would go to prison because ultimately that's up to the judge, as I will come back to later. But at the same time, I was trying to kind of express my deepest condolences for the death of his son, and more than anything I just felt sorry for him. So it was a very challenging, very awkward kind of situation. So before Yasmin's trial at the Old Bailey, I submitted a very detailed court report. It was about 60 A4 pages long, the biggest one I'd written at that time, although I have since smashed that record. And I opined that Yasmin had a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. The schizoaffective disorder is like a combination of schizophrenia symptoms, such as hallucinations and delusions. By the way, I've got previous videos on those if you want to go check them out, and a combination of mood disorders, such as depression or mania. So it's kind of like the worst of both worlds, I would say. So let's fast forward to the day I had to give evidence at the Old Bailey. So this was kind of in the middle towards the end of 2012. I was really nervous. There's a big pomposity of the Old Bailey. There's marble pillars. There's Latin scriptures. I remember feeling quite giddy by it all. So for those of you who don't know, so for example, our foreign viewers, the Old Bailey is also known as the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, and it's in central London. It was made in 1902, which makes it older than your mama. And it is quite a special court. It deals with the major criminal cases within Greater London, and occasionally it takes cases from other parts of England and Wales, high profile kind of murder cases. So to give you some example of people that have been tried at the Old Bailey, that would include Ronnie Kray, who's like this celebrity gangster, and the Yorkshire Ripper. Incidentally, I've done videos on both of them, so go check them out. So at this stage in my career, I had observed some of my previous consultants giving evidence, and I had given evidence myself in less kind of grandiose courts than the Old Bailey, but nothing as big as this. So my recommendation to the court was a defence of not guilty by reason of insanity, also known as the insanity plea or the special verdict. So pay attention, kids, because this is the most educational bit. I educate while you vegetate. So not guilty by reason of insanity, the rules that govern it are the M'Naughton rules. And they say this: the defendant has to have a defective reason which is caused by a disease of the mind, and the mental disorder was such that the accused ought not to be held responsible due to the fact that either 1, they did not know the nature and quality of the act, or number 2, they did not know the act was wrong. So I thought, despite Yasmin's kind of secrecy and overall non-compliance, using all the objective evidence that I had, mostly the witness statements and the interviews with family, I thought on the balance of probabilities, Yasmin was suffering from a defective reason, which is caused by a disease of the mind. So specifically, she had schizoaffective disorders, she had these delusional beliefs that her nephew had demons lurking inside him, and she thought that she was saving him and that she could later resurrect him, and she thought she could harness the power of the full moon. Additionally, on top of that, I thought that her disorder led her to experience like an elevated mood, which disinhibited her thinking and her behavior, and therefore her ability to kind of weigh up the consequences of her actions. So I said she might have known the nature and the quality of her act, i.e. that she was suffocating her nephew, but on the balance of probabilities, she did not know that the act was legally or indeed morally wrong. So that was my defense. And I thought in case the court rejected that defense, I did have a plan B. My plan B was diminished responsibility, which is a partial psychiatric defense. So what that does, it doesn't fully exonerate you like the insanity plea does, but it downgrades murder to manslaughter. The former, murder, carries a mandatory life sentence, whereas latter is completely up to the judge's discretion, that's manslaughter. So the medico-legal criteria is not quite the same for diminished as it is for M'Naughton rules, but there's a big overlap in the arguments. So not guilty by reason of insanity means that technically the defendant is innocent in the eyes of the law, so they can't be sent to prison, but obviously that doesn't mean there are no consequences. Usually the patients are sent for long-term rehabilitation. So in Yasmin's case, I recommended a hospital order under the Mental Health Act, that's section 37, and also a restriction order, that's section 41. So restriction orders are quite rare and they're reserved for the most riskiest defendants. So what that means is the Ministry of Justice shares the decision-making responsibility. So it decides when a patient can have leave in the community and when they've undergone enough rehabilitation, enough treatment to be discharged from hospital. So usually the consultant forensic psychiatrist, such as myself, makes those decisions. With the restriction order, the Ministry of Justice has to give their own nod. So contrary to popular belief, being sectioned in one of my secure hospitals is not an easy ride. So the patients, whereas a prison sentence is finite and determined, a hospital order is not finite. It depends on when the consultant forensic psychiatrist decides when they think the patient is safe enough to have leave. Could be years, could be even decades, lots of different factors. I don't have time to go into them all in this video, but I've done other videos on this. I think I did a video on the process of being sectioned, and also in my prison series, I think it was the second episode, I talk about rehabilitation in a psych unit. So back to my experience at the Old Bailey, I have to say it was quite nerve-wracking because the barrister for the prosecution was using what I thought were quite aggressive and underhand tactics. So for example, their main argument was try and undermine my credibility. So I was a junior doctor at the time, I wasn't a consultant as I am now, and they kept emphasizing that. They just kept asking me over and over again about how junior I was and how much experience I had, as opposed to asking me about the diagnosis or about Yasmin's presentation or about the legal criteria. So it felt like they used quite below the belt kind of tactic. Despite that, I'm glad to say that the judge accepted my recommendation of a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity and my hospital order. So the outcome was that Yasmin was transferred back to the same hospital back to the medium secure unit for long-term rehabilitation. And I have to say, I felt a huge sense of relief, because I knew that a lengthy prison sentence would never have allowed Yasmin to return to a normal self. I'd like to think that it was my performance on the witness stand, that I was really charming and charismatic, but to be perfectly honest, I think it was probably more to do with the circumstances, given the fact that Yasmin was previously untarnished, she was polite, she was differential, she had a supportive, kind of forgiving family, that there appeared to be this sudden wave of psychosis and this inexplicable offence. So, dear viewers, before I conclude, I just want to welcome you to this channel. This is a psych for sore minds. I am a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders in courts and prisons and in secure psychiatric units. In this channel, I address a whole range of topics related to criminality and to mental health issues, talk about my individual cases like I have here, anonymising them, talk about some high profile cases, but I give you my own kind of professional perspective rather than just tell you the facts. I talk about individual diagnoses, I answer questions from the internet, I interview people who have been to prison or who have been sectioned, talk about their experiences. What I'm trying to say is there's something for everybody on this channel. I have some major news for you, which is this. I've actually been writing a book for the last few months, and it is due to be released next spring. It's going to be called In Two Minds, and it's kind of my professional memoirs about my life working as a forensic psychiatrist. It's going to be published by Sphere Publishing. I will actually be talking about Yasmin's Yasmin's offence in my book, but with a lot more kind of detail, talking about the individual interviews that I had with her. And altogether, there's going to be about 30 cases that I have been involved in. It's a lot more kind of personal and more autobiographical than my YouTube videos. Not that I don't love you guys, I just don't have enough time to go into that kind of detail. Another reason why Yasmin's case is important to me, as well as being in my book, is that I'm going to be talking about it at CrimeCon. So CrimeCon, as you'll know, if you're a regular viewer, is this huge true crime convention, massive in the States, coming over to the UK for the first time ever on the 25th and the 26th of September. I'm going to be doing a talk about two people who've killed family members. One of them is Yasmin, and the other one is a farmer. One of them had a mental illness and one of them didn't, so I'll be contrasting their kind of rehabilitation. And breaking news, I'll also be doing a live show with Esther from the True Crime podcast. I'll be talking about Jake Davison, who's the Plymouth killer from the UK who committed an atrocity about 2 months ago now, month and a half. So you got to come, and if you want to come, you can get 10% off if you use the code PSYCH. Details in the link below. I've got your back. Other thing I wanted to say is you really, really must subscribe to this channel. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually makes you a better dancer instead of flailing all your limbs around like a giraffe with a sprained ankle having a seizure like you usually do. Better dancing guaranteed. So, in conclusion, and to give you some closure about Yasmin's case, after almost a year of taking this medication and therapy, Yasmin's psychotic mask kind of fell off, and she disclosed a barrage of paranoid and grandiose delusions. She described seeing hidden messages from God within with the patterns in the curtains at home, and also within the stains in like the prison walls, and also within the shapes in the carpet. So she was having visual hallucinations and had these delusional kind of messages in relation to those hallucinations. And she was absolutely convinced that she was an angel and she had the ability to purify and reincarnate souls, which kind of explains her actions and behavior during the killing of her nephew. However, with medication over time, she started doubting her beliefs, and these beliefs loosened. And I'm sad to say, inevitably, a deep, dark, insidious kind of depression bubbled under the surface as she came to terms with what she had done. So she needed even more medication, even more therapy, including cognitive behavioural therapy, and a huge part of her treatment was family therapy. So it took years for Yasmin to gradually reconnect with her relatives. Her brother, Sonny's father, forgave her, as I said before, and he was also very supportive. He was very present in her recovery in terms of family therapy and just visiting her regularly. So what are my reflections on the case? Well, I have to say that it was, just purely clinically, it was a very edifying experience for me. I got to give evidence at the Old Bailey. I learnt about medico-legal intricacies. I was able to give a defence or evidence about, not guilty by reason of insanity, restriction order, hospital order. It exposed me to the barrister's brutal, underhanded strategies to undermine me, which happens now every time I give evidence in court, but I kind of appreciate it's their job. And so yeah, it really toughened me up as an expert witness. But most importantly, it kind of taught me about the human cost of violence caused by mental illness. I was at the very beginning of my forensic psychiatry career, and it inspired me to continue along this path. Because that kind of connection between mental illness and violence at that point was something that I'd read a lot about in textbooks and in journals, and I'd heard about in lectures and conferences. But it wasn't until I actually spoke to this guarded, paranoid 18-year-old and sat with her brother as we both tried to make sense of this really horrible, senseless act that I fully kind of understand. And I have to say, as a forensic psychiatrist, I've encountered abundant tragedy since then, but there's something so sort of visceral about Yasmin's act. Because what's more devastating than the death of a defenseless child, and also by a relative who was supposed to be caring for them? On a more deeper personal level, the case made me kind of reflect on the magnitude of forgiveness from Yasmin's brother and other family members. And I've asked myself at that time, would I have been capable of such magnanimity? And I didn't know back then. I've had 2 children since then, and I have to say, I still don't know. Just before I finish, as a quick side note, this case reminds me massively of the case of Andrea Yates, who also in a psychotic state drowned her 5 children in 2001 in Houston in America. There's a lot of similarities, so I've done videos on her. Go check them out. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. Stay euthymic, and please do not forget, whatever happens, I love you.